Hello, 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 and welcome to another episode of Pop Culture Therapy. I am Advent Nebula.
And I'm Cruellica Kain.
And this time we're going to take a look at just our taste in comedy and how there seems to be a generational divide between the very young generation that's coming up on the internet versus what we grew up with.
And it's funny because the generational divide is like literally 10 years.
Yeah.
Because we're looking at a lot of the comedy controversy that has happened recently with regards to Dave Chappelle and Chris Rock. We're going to look at those two specifically because they're the ones most in the news.
And then just the reactions the younger generation have when you show them like George Carlin, Richard Pryor, Sam Kinison, and
oh my God,
how they just go, how do us older millennials who resonate more with Gen X humor, how the younger generation of millennials and the Zoomer generation just seem to be offended by that style of comedy.
So, comedy, if you look at comedy throughout the generations, and I'm going to go as far back real quick as, let's look at William Shakespeare.
Yeah.
He's a great example of comedy.
Comedy that meant to have pushed buttons even back in the era of the Victorian age.
So, when William Shakespeare did comedy, and even if you look at it from the Old English standpoint,
Middle English,
or if you look at from the modern English adaptations, which you can look at 10 Things I Hate About You, which is an adaptation of Taming of the Shrew, which is that in Midsummer's Night's Dream. Those are two of your most pivotal comedies.
There's also a modern adaptation of Othello that I can't think of the name of the movie right now because it wasn't named titled Othello.
Yes, I know what you're talking about. But comedy, even back then, was to take social norms and social indecisions of that time and make them prevalent. Because let's look at Midsummer's Night's Dream. Because most people have read it, have seen it, have done something with it. Midsummer's Night's Dream, you have the fool. And he is basically, he has a jackass's head.
Literally.
And so it's a constant joke about him being a jackass because of how he acts, and everybody around them being criticized. Like you have Titania, you have Oberon with their horrible, horrible relationship being on stand.
Oberon's basically a commentary on what a royal should not be like.
And then you have Puck, who is your narrator of it. And he mocks throughout the entirety of the play.
Mocks every single character with no qualms giving.
And this was done quite some time ago. This was done during the Victorian era.
And it was criticizing the royal court in a very satirical way.
And yes, it pushed boundaries and it pushed buttons then. But that's what comedy was known for. Then you had the court jesters. These were the individuals and this goes back to the Middle Ages, like way back. You always had a court jester that was responsible for mocking the nobility. They were free.
They were given the full reign to mock the nobility however they wanted, but at the same time, they were treated like dogs, basically.
Yes, they weren't treated like human beings or anything like that, but they were given that platform to mock the nobility.
They basically could say what the peasants could not say.
They were the voice of the peasants. Then if you go, obviously we're going to skip a whole lot forward to modern times. Well, as modern as the silent film era can get. When you have like Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton, two of the most notable comedians of the silent film era.
And they had physical comedy, but they were always telling some type of commentary with their comedy.
And then you get a little bit forward and you can reference the Marx Brothers.
And Marx Brothers comedy is tongue-in-cheek, but there's always something to be said on Marx Brothers comedy.
And it was very dry. Think of like Duck Soup.
One of the funniest movies you could ever watch, though.
Absolutely. But their humor was very dry. It was very direct, and it cut. Like, even for then, in the 50s.
And then go another several years later, Abbott and Costello start coming out with their comedy duo.
And their comedy was more, yes, it was more family friendly. They did have some, like, not sketchiness, it's a terrible way of saying it, but they had some lewdness in there.
They pushed some boundaries for the late 50s, early 60s with their comedy.
And then let's go to Mel Brooks, which I can't believe there's people who find him to be offensive and racist.
When his whole comedy shtick with his films is making a commentary on racism.
Yes. So Mel Brooks, which really started, I would say, the mid-70s to...
pretty much up to Robin Hood Men in Tights.
Yeah, I would say that's the last big one. Yeah, you do have Dead Loving It.
And the Producers remake.
But primarily, Mel Brooks was known for his comedy, especially on racism, more so for the Jewish culture.
Especially if you watch the original stage production of The Producers. He did Springtime for Hitler, anybody?
No. Well, it's in both the adaptations.
But the stage production, the original version of it, is probably the most priceless way, because it just, the deadpan, when Gene Wilder just comes out with it, that deadpan in the original, you're just like, what? Wow.
Yeah, so you have Springtime for Hitler, which is hilarious. Then you have, which people are offended by now, and this is where we're going to be getting to, with Blazing Saddles. Because Blazing Saddles really pushed the boundaries for comedy with an African-American lead, and a lot of the language that they were using. A lot
of language you cannot actually... You get canceled on any social media using the language in this movie.
And then we're going to go to a little bit around that time still, when you have comedians like Richard Pryor.
George Carlin and Sam Kinison.
And then also, if you think about Eddie Murphy.
Yep.
You also have, for stand-up, you could... Oh, God, there's a lot of stand-up comedians. So I'm just going to go with those three.
And also Gilda Radner at this time, too, was the most controversial female comedian at the time.
Gilda Radner was incredible. So with that, now we're getting into... Like, let's utilize Richard Pryor first. Richard Pryor, he was an incredible comedian. If you have not seen a Richard Pryor movie, you do not know what you're missing with his sense of humor. Because both his humor on his movies as well as his stand-up, you could even go with old Robin Williams stand-up. Ooh.
Yeah.
But you have their stand-up...
Or even Bob Saget's stand-up would actually be on the same level as Richard Pryor's stand-up.
So, Richard Pryor was very... And he utilized his race
to tell a story that would have you laughing, but at the same time would offend somebody out there.
Would offend a lot of people, and even his movies. Because think of the movie Trading Places.
Oh, yeah, that is probably one of the best examples.
So Trading Places, I think it's Gene Wilder.
Yes.
Yes. So, obviously, they switch bodies.
Him and Gene Wilder did 3 different movies together.
Yes.
There's another one where Richard Pryor's blind and Gene Wilder's deaf.
Yes, I remember that movie. Oh, God, that movie was so good. They were very close friends. So you have a movie like Trading Places where you have to have a white man act black versus a black man act white. And so that didn't get as much criticism then. But with our current cancel culture, a lot of people could find it very offensive now.
George Carlin.
Oh, God. George Carlin got so in trouble for
He said the 7 dead words you cannot say on television on live TV.
Yes. So he said George Carlin. I'm going to go with him before Sam Kinison because Sam Kinison
is pretty much the epitome of what cancel culture would cancel today.
Oh, yes. So George Carlin, the 7 words you cannot say on television or radio.
Got in trouble with the FCC because he did it on live TV.
Yes, and he actually did it and didn't get away with it, got in trouble. But George Carlin, just like Richard Pryor or many other comedians, he told it like it was. So if it had to deal with sexuality, if it had to deal with race, if it had to deal with politics, if it had to deal with anything
that was current event-wise, he would just tell it plainly how he saw it. He did not care what anybody thought.
And then Sam Kinison, as you said, is the perfect example of cancel culture. Because his voice can grate a chalkboard.
2, he was always drunk or high on cocaine when he was on stage.
But his comedy was very poignant and direct to the point. And now Chris Rock
was influenced by Sam Kinison. A lot of people do not realize this.
And then we have Dave Chappelle. Dave Chappelle and Chris Rock really got their start in the 90s. The first movie that you can see Dave Chappelle in is Dazed and Confused. And for Chris Rock, actually, his start really was on SNL.
Yeah.
Which a lot of people don't know this, but he was on SNL. And so
him and Adam Sandler started on SNL at the same time. A lot of people don't realize that's why Chris Rock and Adam Sandler are best friends.
So their comedy is very much like their predecessors. The things that you have to know about comedy: first, you have to not be afraid
to say whatever is on your mind.
You have to also not be afraid to possibly offend people.
You actually have to be willing to offend people sometimes to actually get your point across in comedy.
But at the same time, the point is not to offend to harm. The point is to offend where everybody can laugh together in the same room.
And then it's the way George Carlin always looked at it. His comedy, even though he knew it was going to offend somebody was going to think about the point he was making and go, aha, I see what he's saying there.
Like, here are a couple of 2 modern examples of being offensive in a way, but not doing it with malintent. So the first one I'm going to do is Keegan-Michael Key. He did basically for the press secretary's dinner, where he came in as President Obama's anger translator.
Which is one of the most hilarious things you'll ever see for a press secretary dinner.
And so you get to see this, and it's done in a very, very direct way, because even Obama, because it was scripted, yes, it was scripted, even Obama got into it with the scripting, and they made jabs, but people laughed. Was somebody slightly offended by it?
A certain news network was that we won't name.
Yes, but it's not done with actual anger. The second one we can reference is actually the most recent press secretary's dinner with Trevor Noah. He was on the stage. He picked on the current president. He picked on the former president. He picked on a whole ton of people in the room.
He even picked on President Obama, who was in the room, and made a joke about him and Biden when they were in the White House together.
But everybody laughed. Even the people who are being offended, who are being told the joke on. They were the butt of the joke.
They were laughing during it.
Laughing. Now, this is not to say that you should pick on somebody at their expense. I'm not saying that you pick on people to be mean.
You know your audience.
You have to know your audience.
That's one of the biggest important things about comedians. They knew their target audience.
If you think of Robin Williams. Now, picture in your mind Robin Williams. You're going to picture Mrs. Doubtfire. You're going to picture
Jeannie,
and you're going to see all these, pictures in your mind of his family-friendly period.
Go watch an HBO special of Robin Williams.
From the 70s.
Or even his 90s comedy special.
Oh, yes.
His 90s comedy special he did in the late 90s, it harkens back to his 70s and 80s comedy before he did Mork and Mindy.
He was not your family-friendly dad or genie or whatever you picture when you think of Robin Williams. Same thing with Bob Saget.
Bob Saget, if you've ever seen The Aristocrats, which is a documentary on the most offensive joke that's been around and this is a joke that's been around since the 1700s, that they just had comedians retell and tell and tell and tell. Bob Saget and Doug Stanhope have the two most offensive versions of this joke.
And for them, for Bob Saget specifically, everybody knows him as the sweet and loving dad from Full House. My experience outside of Full House was I pulled up because I saw Bob Saget. I was so excited. It was one of his comedy routines.
Why he was doing America's Funniest Home Video.
And I was like, but he's the dad. He's Mr. Chan. And so my mind was blown. I was a kid when I had seen this. Because it was in the early years of watching Full House. So I've always known, like, wow, okay, he is out there with his comedy. So in recent times, we've had two comedians, the two we've mentioned, Chris Rock and
Dave Chappelle.
Dave Chappelle.
Chappelle with his Netflix specials, and Chris Rock with some of his comments after the Will Smith slap.
Now, obviously, Chris Rock hasn't been canceled.
People have been defending Chris Rock.
Well, there have been people who have been taking it out on him because what had happened if, like we mentioned in our last podcast, if somehow you've been living under a rock, during the Oscars on live television,
he made a joke about Jada Pinkett Smith's hair loss, and Will Smith walks up on stage and bitch slaps him right across the face.
But what is so hypocritical about this entire thing is when he makes the joke about her alopecia, saying she's going to be G.I. Jane 2, which I
cracked up at that.
I gotta laugh because not thinking about her alopecia, which is an actual legitimate disease, but just because remembering Demi Moore with a bald ass head, you could see her when they pan to the audience, you could see her and Will laughing.
And then she gives him the dirty ass look.
And he goes up and slaps Chris Rock. So a lot of people have been very split on Will Smith was defending his wife, Chris Rock was in the wrong because he shouldn't have made a joke like that.
But that's been Chris Rock's shtick since the early 90s.
Now, if you ask Kaiju has always hated Chris Rock's humor because you have to get a feel for the comedians. In all honesty, if you don't like that comedian, because there's a few out there that, like, no. But, like Jimmy Kimmel, I'm not a huge fan of his comedy, but
where I don't really like it either. I think we both prefer Colbert for late night comedy.
I prefer Colbert comedy, even when he did the Colbert Report. But I've always enjoyed Chris Rock's humor because I understood his humor.
And I've always liked Chris Rock's humor. One of my favorite jokes is, you know you have a problem when you're walking into a strip club and it's daylight outside still. So
for him, I appreciated him because I can't even personally say, as a human being, that the joke was in poor taste. Because she has had for many years, Jada Pinkett has had her hair cut short. Admittedly, I knew she had alopecia, but I didn't think about it consciously because
we've been so used to it, we don't even think about it.
And it was a joke, not in malice. It was just a joke. And so, do I think that Will Smith should be canceled? No. I think, one, I don't think it was a hoax. I don't think it was staged. I do think it was legitimate.
And it had to be legitimate, otherwise the Oscars wouldn't ban him for 10 years.
But at the same time, I also don't think that Chris Rock should be canceled for his joke. It was a joke That's what people do. That's what they get paid for. I have seen many jokes that have pushed the boundaries, and there have been times like, ugh, I probably wouldn't have gone there, but that's why it's not my job.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the one that's truly been canceled is Dave Chappelle.
For his comedy specials on Netflix and some of his comments.
So, Dave Chappelle, if you've never seen a stand-up special of his, or you've never seen the Dave Chappelle show, nothing is a boundary.
And nothing's been off limits to Dave Chappelle. It's, in a way, he's kind of the modern day Sam Kinison, where nothing's off limits.
He believes in having fun with his comedy. Like, he is picked on his own race. He is picked on, like, my favorite skit of his from the Dave Chappelle show it's the skit on It's a Wonderful Life, but it's with a woman who has very big tits. I love that skit because it's ridiculous. And I've known when he's played the white characters, when he's played his coked out characters.
Yeah, his coked out character. One of his most famous characters. You got any more of that cocaine?
Or when he played the black guy who was blind and thought he was white and was a part of the KKK.
Yeah, which is probably the most offensive skit he has ever done.
He was picking on the KKK very clearly, but he was also picking on some of what he felt were the legitimate stereotypes of his race. And I enjoyed it for the comedy aspect because, one, I haven't seen skit comedy like that outside of SNL except for Mad TV.
Or Kids in the Hall.
Kids in the Hall, or,
Kids in the Hall coming back with their new 6-episode Amazon special saying they're going to be more offensive than they have ever been.
Which I'm so excited for. So when you get that type of comedy, and when you see his stand-up specials, he, just like Trevor Noah is, and Trevor Noah has that presentation for The Daily Show, Pete Davidson's stand-up specials are horrid.
Yeah, and then go back to Monty Python. Even though those guys still do their same comedy shticks today, John Cleese has even said that he doesn't even care about what the younger generation thinks about his comedy. He's going to do his comedy as it is.
And so when I think of Dave Chappelle, I take his jokes for what they are. Jokes. Because he has picked on women, he has picked on gay people, heterosexual people.
It's basically, if South Park has made a joke about it, Dave Chappelle has made a joke about it.
So, why he has been canceled recently?
When Trey and Matt for South Park have made the exact same jokes.
And so he made a joke about a trans person. Actually, he made a joke about a specific trans person. One of his personal friends. He made a joke about them. Just like anyone would in their skit. And the trans community, well, and it's hard to say.
It's more of what sparked it was a trans employee at Netflix that got offended that they had to work on the comedy special.
So Netflix employees who are trans, some of them got offended. I can't say all of them got offended because I don't know.
It was two very vocal ones on Twitter is all we really know about.
And we do know a number of other people were very offended. And the hard part about jokes of any comedy is somebody will get offended. That is the purpose of the joke. The reason of any of this comedy is not for malice, but it's to highlight something. It's to highlight and recognize people are in the zeitgeist. Like, let's look at George Carlin. George Carlin he actually talked about pedophiles or pedophilia, about like the old answering machines, or how people left really creepy voice messages, to like utilizing their children as like
It's
trophies.
Yeah, and it was one of the his skits from the late 80s.
Late 80s, early 90s. And he was talking about how you need to be more conscious of how you put your kids out there. But he did it in a very joking manner that gave rise to it, but did it in a way that still offended people.
Yeah. Another comedian that did it, Bill Hicks, when the Rodney King riots were going on, he was, and Letterman had Hicks on all the time. People got very offended by some of the stuff Hicks would make comedy about before he died.
And so, do I think he should be canceled for his joke? No. And this is where a generational gap comes in. When you have individuals like ourselves who are a little over 40, damn near 40.
Yeah, almost near 40.
That
grew up on the comedy of the comedians like Carlin Hicks, Kennison, Pryor, Saget, Williams in their heyday. We grew up on this comedy.
And there's a lot of female comedians as well. So
Gilda Radner, God, I can't think of her name right now.
You could even think of Chelsea Handler.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
I'm trying to think of the one that's really good friends with Lewis Black. Kathleen Manigan. She's extremely offensive comedian.
Well, Whitney and Cummings at the same time. So you have a lot of comedians who, they offend people. And the joke always within the comedy community is if somebody is not offended, you're doing it wrong.
Look at Denver comedian Josh Blue. He's a comedian who's got cerebral palsy who makes fun of the fact he has cerebral palsy.
And, I saw him live. He's incredible.
And he actually did marry a Japanese-American woman, and he makes jokes nowadays about having to raise half Japanese, half white kids. And one of them is showing signs of having cerebral palsy like him. So he's making comedy about that.
Or even Christopher Titus. Christopher Titus
always makes fun of his ex-wife.
Always makes fun of his ex-wife. Always makes fun of his very toxic childhood. Which I've appreciated because I had the same childhood.
He had a sitcom that basically showed of his dad how it was.
So, I don't take offense to it. Do I understand why people could? Absolutely. I think it's only fair that people have everybody has a choice to be offended by whatever they want to be offended by, or choose not to watch that comedian. There's plenty of comedians I will never, like Joe Rogan. I will never touch him with the 10-foot pole.
I liked Rogan in the old days, but ever since that podcast he started, he's gone off the rails.
But how do you feel about the situation?
With Chappelle, it's like people missed the joke. I don't understand why he got canceled for that. But at the same time, I can understand where some of the younger generation, just from working with some people that are trans, I can see where, yes, I can see where they got offended, but it's like you're going to be pretty much kicking a hornet's nest if you try to explain the point of Chappelle's joke.
Well, and the other challenge of it is, I respect anybody who's offended by it, but I also think it could be a great conversation starter. Like, rather than just, because that's what I look at comedy for. I look at comedy as a great way to have a conversation, because when, like Patton Oswalt hedges on that, not lewd, but that family-friendly, same thing with Jim Gaffigan.
Yeah, Jim Gaffigan, very, for the most part, family-friendly, but there's times you're like, okay, the kids are going to laugh at that, but let's hope I don't have to be in the uncomfortable position of explaining that joke.
Exactly. So I look at it as a great opportunity of being like, okay, what does this mean? And I look at also like Larry the Cable Guy. He plays a great task of hedging on that like no knowledge hick to almost being like slightly on that overly white type trope.
And then Eddie Izzard, even though he does his shtick in cross-dress, is pretty much a family-friendly comedian for the most part.
Oh, I love Eddie Izzard. But that's one of the challenges that you have is, but in the modern era where we do have cancel culture, and I'm not going to talk about cancel culture like you hear some of the Republicans doing because they're ridiculous. I look at cancel culture as an unfair situation because you're canceling somebody without actually evaluating the purpose of it.
You're not trying to find the point. You just got offended by it and you're making a decision, snap decision on that without taking the full context.
And then when you have people in power getting offended, you start ruining lives. And I don't necessarily feel that we should ruin somebody's life because you don't appreciate a joke.
Yeah.
And if you don't appreciate the joke, rather than forcing the person like Dave Chappelle to double down, you're not allowing it to be a teaching moment.
Yeah. And for the history of comedy, it's always been there as a commentary on society. If you do not understand that, you're not getting the point of comedy.
Like, here's a quote from Rowan Atkinson. And if you don't know who Rowan Atkinson is, he's Mr. B, which is like a joke version of Mr. Magoo. Also, he played in the series Black Adder, where Black Adder is a 4-part series that goes through different periods of British history. And it's very dry humor. It's very direct humor. And as you go along in the versions, it does get a little malicious, but not malicious where people can't have fun with it.
And people that were fans of House go back and watch Black Adder.
And they're like, oh my God, Hugh Laurie? He's so different than he is in House. But his quote here, which I love, is, "It does seem to me that the job of comedy is to offend, or have the potential to offend, and it cannot be drained of that potential. Every joke has a victim. That's the definition of a joke. Someone or something or an idea is made to look ridiculous." And basically, he says, I think you've got to be very, very careful about saying what you're allowed to make jokes about. You've always got to kick it up, really. What if there's someone extremely smug, arrogant, self-satisfied who happens to be below in society? They are not all in the House of Parliament or in monarchies. There are a lot of extremely smug and self-satisfied people in what would be deemed lower down in society who also deserve to be pulled up. In a proper free society, you should be allowed to make jokes about absolutely anything. Not all jokes are for everyone.
Yeah.
And
that's been the history of comedy throughout the ages.
And how I take the gist of that portion of the quote is to say that, like, okay, look at Caitlyn Jenner. She is a trans woman. And she is very political. She's actually, in a way, very anti-trans, which frustrates the hell out of me because there's hypocrisy there.
And that's the reason why Caitlyn's a butt of a lot of jokes.
And so, what if that joke, just to flip it on its head, was about her? Would that change the context of the joke? Would it be off limits still? Or would it be okay because you're talking about somebody most people unilaterally don't like?
And that's one of the big questions you always have to come up with when you're looking at the cancel culture with modern comedy.
Because you do, as you said earlier, have to know your audience. And for Dave Chappelle's audience, he knows that he can be himself. Because people know know what his type of humor is like, and know what his type of comedy is.
People who enjoy Chris Rock know he's a protege of the Sam Kinison era, where it's just basically, I'm an insult comic.
And as sad as it is, people who are fans of Joe Rogan know what to expect from his comedy as well. And just because it's not my cup of tea, doesn't mean there aren't people who like it. Or there aren't people who do like it. because obviously he was supposed to be canceled, and we see how well that went.
He's a multi-millionaire on Spotify.
So you can't have your cake and eat it too. You have to be conscious. And sometimes with comedy, you have to leave at least for us older individuals, we're so trained that we're like, okay, you just kind of have to leave your feelings at the door. You go in, know what you're going to be expecting, and you have enjoyment with it. If you don't like the joke, you don't laugh at the joke.
Yeah. And when you're going into one of you pretty much know when you're going to go see a stand-up comedy routine, you know what you're going to be walking into. If you don't, there's a problem.
But that goes along to the generational gap. Even though, and this is a clear dividing line, I would say it's from when the internet era really started. So
well, anybody born after 1992, I want to say.
I would say 92, 93. That's like the dividing line. So from 80 to 93, we lived our lives closer to like the Gen Xers because that's how we were raised. Could it be right? Could it be wrong? That's in the eye of the beholder.
But for the most part, when you look at online trends on social media and stuff, there is a clear dividing line between people born before 92 and after 92.
So when you look at that, you see the younger generations, post 92 and current, their view on comedy.
It's basically the Paul Brothers, Filthy Frank. That's the kind of comedy they seem to enjoy.
But they also like the comedy. They like the YouTube comedy. And the benefit with YouTube is you have your pick of comedians.
Yeah, there is a plethora of them on there.
You can pick your poison. You can throw a dart. Like, think about, I like the Watcher channel that has Shane Madej and Ryan Bergara. They were on BuzzFeed Unsolved for a number of years. Their comedy is very dry and witty.
Or I like Adam Conover from the old College Humor days.
Oh, yes.
Which is another very dry, but his comedy harkens back to the Hicks, the Carlin, the Pryor. He's having a political point to say at some point.
And admittedly, I will say a lot of the newer up-and-coming comedians that are younger, probably in their mid to late 20s, I at times, let's use Pete Davidson as an example. Yes, he is very gritty and he does hearken from a lot of the older comedians. He's also younger, so his comedy also takes an influence from how the younger generation looks at comedy. They look at comedy where they'll offend, but they offend on a very broad sense versus targeted. And that's how I think comedy really has changed. A lot of comedy is more politically targeted versus targeting social commentary.
Which shows it really has changed, where it's going to be very interesting to see how it evolves over time, because when you're starting to lose that social commentary aspect, where's it going to go?
Well, and social commentary, I think, is important for comedy. And that's not to say that none of the comedians from the younger group do social commentary, but it's very, very limited.
And when they do it, it's very vague, like they're trying not to offend somebody.
And it's hard to work around the comedy where you don't push any boundaries, because I even see it with SNL at times. They very rarely push boundaries. Not like the 90s. 90s is like the heyday for SNL.
The 90s and the mid-70s with the original cast.
Yeah. With the original cast, and then when you had the new, really great up-and-comers. Like you had Mike Myers, you had
Will Ferrell,
Adam Sandler,
Chris Rock, John Lovitz, Phil Hartman.
And then you had, then you have Tina Fey, you have Amy Poehler, you have
Kristen
Maya
Wiig.
Rudolph. you have so many comedians that push the boundaries, that use their social commentary to do it. And the only time I think you get that social commentary comedy that is not afraid is when you get the Weekend Update with Jost and Jay.
Yeah, they just like, you know what? We're going to tell it how we see it.
And so it's sad to see that comedy has to be a little bit more considerate, because it's not as fun.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that you have to go into comedy to offend somebody or piss somebody off, but sometimes you're like, oh, that's like bad. Like now I only get that if I watch the roasts.
Or if you try and watch Bill Maher the last 5 years.
Oh God. Bill Maher is another story. In all honesty, I've never found him funny.
I found him funny earlier in his career, but ever since he's just turned into just a political punching bag comedian, it's like, eh.
Yeah. But so cancel culture and being offended by comedy is really interesting and kind of sad. I'm not saying that everybody has to like the same comedy, and I'm not saying that comedy doesn't have to adapt, but you kind of just have to breathe and know that they're not offending you directly.
Yeah, look at modern Lewis Black. He basically makes a commentary on his entire boomer generation and on how much he hates what the boomer generation's become.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm actually surprised he hasn't been canceled.
Canceled by the right side of the aisle of political, because that's where he's roasting his entire comedy anymore.
That's very true. But no matter what your age group is, definitely be open to comedy and not be afraid to see a comedian push the boundaries. If it's a little too much for you, I honestly respect that. I don't think there's anything wrong with it.
There isn't. You're going to find comedians out there that are just, especially if you go back and watch some of the older comedians, they're going to hearken to topics that you're going to be very uncomfortable with if you're a part of the younger generation.
Oh, yeah, because racism, and it's anti-racism, not pro-racism, but anti-racism, racist comments. So the way they get to their point is very vicious.
And the commentary on the Reagan administration is very, very reminiscent of 2016 to 2020, how this country was going.
Yes, yes. When they make comments about Reaganomics, it's hard. And if you think that Reaganomics doesn't exist anymore,
you're wrong.
It does. I'm sorry.
It's just escalated.
But that's kind of all I think we have on the topic of comedy. So tell us who your favorite comedians are, because I'm always open to looking at new comedy.
Yeah, we're open to seeing it. Yeah, I've checked out some of the modern comedy. It's like there's some I enjoy that pushes the boundaries from some of the newer ones, but not the Paul brothers. Please don't bring up the Paul brothers.
No. The one comedian that we forgot to talk about that pushes a lot of boundaries, that sometimes I worry about him getting canceled, is Weird Al.
I don't think you can cancel Weird Al, especially with Daniel Radcliffe playing him in the biopic.
You never know, but hopefully not. But with that said, we'll see you next time. Bye!